Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Hall, and I'm the Executive Director of Resilience First. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Resilience First webinar. By way of introduction, Resilience First was created just over 2 years ago to help build resilience in business communities, whether they be communities defined by geography or special interest. For those of you who viewed the opening video, I hope you gained a brief insight on our organisation. Since its inception, we have attracted a wide range of major companies as champions, as well as a host of affiliated organisations and members of our network. All are willing to spread the word through best practice learnings. So for today's webinar, I warmly welcome PA Consulting as our co-hosts, and particularly Cate, a partner at PA, who will chair today's proceedings. Thank you. I will allow her to welcome our two excellent speakers we have this morning and introduce what must surely be a timely and appropriate subject, especially on the back of the COVID crisis. And the topic is national resilience. What does it mean? For the speakers' organisations, as well as Resilience First and PA, national preparedness and resilience are central themes of our work. I'm personally delighted that we have the opportunity to discuss some of the key issues in this forum. And the political events over the weekend have given it added spice, I guess. I invite the audience to ask questions of the speakers throughout the session by posting your short written questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. I'm sure the chair will pick up as many of those questions as she can as we progress through the webinar. I should add that the speakers' bios are in your joining instructions, and we will be sending out a summary of the proceedings after the event. So, Cate, the virtual floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I'm delighted to be here, and PA is delighted to be hosting this with Resilience First. COVID-19 has illustrated just how important national resilience is, and we've got two great speakers to talk on that today. Elisabeth, Senior Research Fellow at RUSI, will be talking about national resilience, and Alex, Deputy National Security Advisor, leading on the integrated review, will talk about national preparedness. So thank you both for being here. You've got their bios, as Robert said, so I'll introduce them very briefly before each speak, and welcome questions in the chat during the session. We can pick up any speaker-specific questions after each talk, but there'll also be time for joint questions after both Alex and Elisabeth have finished speaking. So just a few words to kick off on the integrated review. As we emerge from our COVID-19 hibernation, we can already see a growing focus on national and local resilience. The Cabinet Officers launched the integrated review of the UK's foreign policy, defence, security and international development, designed to achieve a more integrated and cost-effective approach to the shared challenges such as the application of science and technology, and also the changing character of allies and adversaries. The integrated review will report in a very different context to the one it set out in. We can draw on the lessons learned from the interdepartmental cooperation tackling the pandemic, the challenging economic situation, and the global stability that we'll see at the end as we emerge, and the new ways of working that will make digital and cyber all the more important as the key routes to effectively running our business, our lives and the country. And the fact that we're on webinar is just an illustration of that. Together, these factors have a significant impact on the traditional guardians of our national security. And the pandemic has taught us that there's a renewed imperative to build an adaptive, multi-skilled community, including high-tech health firms, technology industry, Formula One engineering teams, amongst others, and bring them together in the national interest. In this light, national resilience is an even more important topic within the integrated review than it was before, as we start to look at both how we've responded to COVID and what a successful economic future living with COVID, I'm not going to say in the post-COVID world, but living with COVID as we go forward will look like. The role of defence and security and national resilience will inevitably increase, and we'll see the new normal settle into a routine of remote working and social distancing for the foreseeable future. Key to that will be capturing and embedding the good elements of our rapid transition to remote working, and make sure that we have taken away the risks that will have inevitably crept in during the initial decisions on systems and processes. There'll be an increasing expectation of defence and security to take a role in national resilience. I'd suggest probably with no obvious reduction in expectation of their traditional scopes, and an increasing realisation that greater national resilience can also act as a deterrent as the impact of any malicious action is reduced, and also enable defence and security to focus on the things that only they can deliver. So the greater resilience of the nation rises and the overall ability to cope with disruption increases. So the integrated review therefore brings the opportunity to look at how to change the role of defence and security to move up the information value chain and increase the benefit from information and analysis that we can now use in the digital world, to better join up across government, to fuse the complementary capabilities across departments, and importantly, build the trust and understanding to use those capabilities effectively, and to effectively engage the whole of the UK, blending the best of government and industry, which is why this audience is key. So I'm really looking forward to the talks from Elisabeth and Alex, who are absolutely at the heart of this thinking, and to the questions and discussions afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elisabeth. Elisabeth directs RUSI's Modern Deterrence programme, which focuses on how governments and businesses and civil society can work better together to strengthen the defence against existing and emerging threats. With a background across commercial, journalism, international foreign policy, Elisabeth also engages at the top level of UK, Nordic and Baltic leadership as a member of the Aurora Forum. Elisabeth, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cate, and thank you, Robert, for the invitation. It's interesting to see the reaction or to see the change in mood about resilience, to have seen it over the past few months, because it's not that long ago that people who like me and you, Cate, and Robert and Alex too, I believe, who were talking about resilience were seen as maybe a little bit of fear mongers, and that we worried about things that were just not that relevant or not that serious. But here we are, and COVID-19 is clearly the decisive point that changed the public mood. But can I just mention one other thing which really highlights the need for resilience? It's the very frightening development that is underway, especially in the UK, but in other countries as well, where people who are consuming totally bonkers conspiracy theories on social media linking 5G to coronavirus are setting fire to 5G antennas, several dozen such cases in the UK in recent months, and other cases in other European countries as well. It just highlights how important it is for our society to be resilient and for everybody to play their part, because these people who are consuming 5G conspiracy theories on the internet are clearly not thinking about the implications of their actions on society. But there are implications, because if 5G services go down, we won't be able to work at home or work from home as we are now supposed to do. So it all hangs together. So why is resilience important? Well, I think to those listening to this or participating in this webinar, it's clear why it's important. It's important because without it, we are completely exposed and vulnerable to whichever calamity comes our way, whether it's a calamity like coronavirus thought up by Mother Nature, or whether it's a calamity or a form of aggression thought up by our adversaries. And our adversaries are, of course, very well aware of the fact that we are so poorly prepared for contingencies below the military or armed forces threshold. For military aggression, we are phenomenally well prepared, and our armed forces here in the UK are first rate. But for everything else, what do we do about that? Well, not very much. The government does its part, but as we have seen, it's just not enough to have preparedness within government. The rest of society has to be prepared too. And if we look at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis here in the UK, and in fact in most other countries, what happened was that the coronavirus took hold, then governments, including the UK government, announced lockdowns. People panicked and started stockpiling goods. And even if they didn't think they were stockpiling, they bought a little bit more than usual, which meant that supermarkets ran out of food. This is how a societal crisis comes about, not through any malice by anybody for the most part, but by complete lack of forward-thinking, education, preparedness. And that's why resilience matters so much, because this won't be the last crisis. There will be many more crises, whether crises caused by Mother Nature or crises caused by hostile states. And if our only preparedness is whatever the government can drum up, that is just too attractive an opportunity for our adversaries to pass up. I think not just I can guarantee, it is certain that our armed forces or our adversaries will exploit that vulnerability because neither the business community, and I'm happy to answer questions from the participants from the business community in the Q&A later, but it's fair to say that the business community has just not been involved in national preparedness to the extent that's needed, through no fault of their own. There just hasn't been a system for to involve them, and even more so that's true for the wider public. And I think the fallacy that we in liberal democracies have lived with is that we can have a government that looks after every national security need, and we, the public, can just look after ourselves, and somehow that will then seamlessly come together. It won't seamlessly come together because we, the wider public, have to be willing and educated to do things that are not, or to prepare and to act in ways that don't just benefit ourselves, but benefit the wider community. So if I can just start with the business community, how can the business community and industry play a larger role in national resilience? Well, they already look after themselves. What's not happening so much is for the business community or industry more widely to engage and plan with the government and the armed forces. And something actually that is currently underway in Sweden, I think would be useful for the UK to learn from. It's a total defense exercise, the first ever since 1988. So it's led by the armed forces, and the Civil Contingencies Agency involves government agencies, obviously the armed forces, government agencies plus government at every level, so national, regional and local, plus industry and citizen volunteers, practicing gray zone scenarios or a wide range of scenarios. That sort of thing, I think, would be extremely useful here in the UK. I realize we probably won't have a full-blown total defense exercise, but what about exercises where businesses get to practice with the armed forces, with the wider government, get to practice a wide range of scenarios? I used to work in crisis consulting. Businesses practice so kidnap scenarios all the time, but they need to practice scenarios that are not just tactical involving their businesses, but strategic involving the whole country, crises involving the whole country. Then, by the way, I'm happy to send you afterwards an FT op-ed I wrote on that, I think half a year or a year ago. Then how do we incentivize more resilience or better resilience within companies? I think there could be something like a royal warrant or the equivalent of a fair trade label that companies that have have reached a certain degree of resilience, and that would have to be defined, that they can use, so that customers, including ordinary consumers, so that they know when they buy a product from a company that it reaches an acceptable resilience standard. Then another thing is to involve the shareholders. What if the government required resilience reporting in annual reports. We have already, obviously, CSR reporting in annual reports, and companies do their best to show how good they are in CSR. What about resilience? Either as required by the government or just as sort of a peer pressure factor, so that companies would feel that they needed to show they are resilient because their competitors are showing it in their annual reports, and shareholders would look for that reporting or such details in annual reports. Then the wider public, and I know I'm going slightly over time here, but the wider public, it's phenomenally important. As we have seen, it's just not sustainable in a future crisis to have the public so unprepared as it was here in the UK when coronavirus struck. And I think many of us here on this webinar are familiar with the sort of conversations that went on before coronavirus, when people like us would point out that it might be a good idea to plan ahead, and it was just considered, as I said earlier, a bit over the top and maybe a bit like fear-mongering. And I must say, so this is before Alex took his current post, I had conversations with the relevant parts of the Cabinet Office. And at one point, I proposed that the UK might like to do something like Sweden and now Lithuania and Latvia have done, which is to publish a leaflet informing people, the wider public, every citizen, what to do in case of a crisis, whether it be a military contingency or any other sort of contingency. And what the public needs to do in such cases is just look after themselves, know that, make sure they have the right type of food at home, have torches at home, have a radio that they don't need to charge, and so forth. Very easy steps. And for example, earthquake zones do that all the time. I used to live in San Francisco. We had constant public awareness campaigns about what you need to do to prepare so that you're fine when an earthquake strikes, because you're on your own for 72 hours. That's a message from the city government in San Francisco, and similarly in other earthquake zones. So I proposed that the UK could do something like what Sweden had done with its leaflet. It's called If Crisis or War Comes, that was sent to all households and had very easy instructions. And the response I got was that no, it would frighten people. But my point is that the crises will come and they will frighten people. So it's better to frighten people if that is indeed their reaction. It's better to frighten them ahead of time when they can plan and get used to the idea that a crisis will occur, and they can plan so that we don't have to improvise on the spot like we've had to do with coronavirus. So with easy steps like that, we'll have a much more prepared public. We'll have a public that doesn't panic when the next crisis occurs, and we'll have a better understanding among the wider public that a crisis will occur and that they can have a role in mitigating the effects of that crisis, and as a result, shortening the circumstances of the extraordinary circumstances where life goes a bit funny. So that's the first step. And then the second step is something that actually the S&P has now picked up based on suggestions I've put forward, and that's resilience training for teenagers. So teenagers are the only way currently in which they engage with national security is if they join the armed forces. Some teenagers obviously do the DOE scheme or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, but that's not really national security, and it's not linked in any way to the government and how it would act or respond in a crisis. What I've proposed is resilience training for teenagers between the penultimate and last year of secondary school, 3 weeks, where teenagers on a voluntary basis would learn the basics of resilience. So disaster response, first aid, crisis preparedness, disinformation or information literacy. And it would be incentivized through UCAS points, or if they are going straight into the labor market, it would be incentivized through tax credits. And that way we'd have a critical mass of the population that knows what to do in a crisis and can look after themselves, and importantly can look after their family and their wider community. And these graduates would also be plugged into the blue light services, so that they could function as essentially the lowest level below gold, silver, and bronze, and they could be a resource for the first responders. And that's something, as I said, that the S&P has picked up and made it. They want to include not just teenagers, but people who are between jobs or who are retired. I think that's a fantastic step, and watch to see what happens with their thinking and planning on that. So I'll stop here and look forward to answering questions later, and obviously to listening to Alex's points as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elisabeth. Really interesting points there around what government, industry and the public can be doing. There are a few questions coming in. I'm going to save them all to the end because there are some interesting themes coming through. So I'll hand over now to Alex. Alex started as Deputy National Security Advisor at one of the most interesting times in government. In January, looking after the integration review, coming from a background in the Department for Exiting the EU, ambassadorial posts, and Director of Strategy in the Foreign Office. So an amazing level of insight into government thinking and the cross-departmental challenges that place you perfectly for the complex task at hand, Alex. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Cate. Thank you, Rob, for the invitation. Elisabeth, very nice to hear you speak as well. And hello to everybody. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. So indeed, I was asked to come in at the beginning of this year to help with the integrated review. For those who don't know, that's a kind of every 5 years, we have a look at all of our spend and our systems in the defence, development, diplomacy, security world. And we then work out, well, what are the long-term, what are our long-term aims, and where do we put our money to be able to fulfill them, and how do we change our systems to be able to deliver them. So we'll produce one of those sometime this autumn, almost certainly. It has to be linked to a multi-year spending review, because that's where the spend decisions get done. So let me start by standing a bit like a diplomat that I usually am. We just kind of what the world in which this review is taking place. There's a couple of very obvious points at the beginning. First of all, the UK is an unusually global country by land, by people, by its economy, and by its culture. It's a pretty big economy, one of the top ones in the world, not a superpower, but a big economy. But even by the standards of those big economies, we are very global, and we are very open, and we have benefited from that. And I'll come back to that in a second, because I think COVID throws that into relief. So we're a naturally international company. We'll need an international country, and we need to operate internationally. There's some continuity as we think about the review. Some of the threats, which some of you on this call will be familiar with, they remain, whether they are threats from other countries, whether they're threats from terrorism or from crime, and also from vulnerability to certain global issues, of which climate change is probably the biggest one, biodiversity as well. So those are quite familiar, but I think we're coming into a new world, and a new world in a few different ways. So firstly, I think that China is no longer rising. China has risen and is a superpower in many areas, and aspires to becoming even more stronger. And that offers opportunities for the UK, and certainly for businesses, including with exports and investment. It also carries some risks in terms of China's intent. And so we're both going to be cooperating with China, which we want to do in many areas, including, for example, climate change, but at the same time presents some risks as well. There's a very significant US response to that as the other great superpower. And I think the United States, for the first time, is looking at a country which it can compete with it economically, in economic power terms. And that's a very big deal. And I think the next 10 years, if you think about countries, is going to be really dominated by the relationship between those two and what consequences it has. The other obvious thing I would pick up is the speed of change of technology, and the influence of technology on all of our lives, as seen by what we're doing now. And finally, the UK being in a new situation. We've left the European Union. We are fully sovereign, and that presents some opportunities, for example, in our trade policy, border management, which I think will be important as part of the review, sanctions policy, a few other immigration. So yeah, we're in a new situation in this new world. And I think that COVID, which others have mentioned, shines a light on certain things. It's accelerated that trend, that US-China tension, a great power competition, as people from the academic world might call it. It's also, obviously, as Elisabeth's been saying, shone a very sharp light on some of the vulnerabilities we carry in our resilience domestically, but also internationally as well. We've seen a rise in protectionism, and I think C19 will also lead to, obviously, going to lead to a much larger government deficit. In other words, what we don't know is the government's response to that. It's determined not to go through kind of an austerity as per 2010, and you should look at the Prime Minister's speech he's giving today in Dudley about a new approach to the economy, but we'll have a bigger deficit. So I just kind of observe there's some continuities, but it is a new world, and C19 has shown a very sharp light on some things, including, I think, our national and international resilience. And what it's brought forward is, the proximity between economic issues and security in terms of resilience. We looked at some of the ways that supply chains have worked during the lockdown. And in some cases, they worked very effectively, but there was a real closing down of an increase in protectionism, certain key products, mainly in the medical world, but it's had to sort of look at that and think, well, how do we adapt to that? So resilience will be definitely a theme, or it was always going to be a theme of the review from when I started at the beginning of the year, but I think it becomes an even bigger theme. And resilience, I think, meaning the ability for us, to the UK, to be able to anticipate, to be able to deter, to be able to withstand, to be able to respond to, and to recover. Those 5 verbs from risks and incidents. And some of those are malicious and some of those are non-malicious, but being able to bounce back better, basically. And we've seen that there are natural hazards. We know there are conventional threats which are very familiar to many on the call, including cyber, which I think again has grown, and C19 has shown that there's a cyber threat that we deal with, and then risks to the economy of the UK and to our economic security, including predatory investments in areas which we don't want, where we think that there are risks behind that investment. We are basically open economy, but I think we have to be a bit more clear-eyed about those things. And when we see the change in the nature of risk, we see, for example, in cyber, it's a good example of that, in the fact that quite often states are using non-state actors and proxies in order to be able to carry out attacks in the UK system. And I fear many of you may have been victims of those or be aware of those. I think that the level of complexity we have in our systems is high and getting higher as they become more automated and digitalized, and our ability to understand those systems and to be able to protect them, I think, has to increase. So what do we do? That's partly what the review is about, and we're getting into it, so I'm very interested to hear people's views on that, the answer to that question. Now, part of that, and portraying my background, is international. That fragility abroad can cause harm at home. That's a familiar theme, but I think they know where in the world do we need to act to be able to reduce fragility, to increase resilience, so that it doesn't cause harm at home. And that's, we have to have the ability to be able to act in those areas, whether it's in conflict or post-conflict or pre-conflict. And we have to be able to join up all of our different instruments. And of course, you'll have seen that we're going to merge the Foreign Office and DFID. And I hope that's a department which can really achieve that effect, working with the Ministry of Defence and with others as well. We have to work with partners, with friends and allies, so that very rarely we're going to do this on our own. And some of that would be allies, particularly say in defence, and some of it we with partners all around the world. So we'd want to work with both China and the United States on health resilience. Now that's a hard thing to do, but we need to work with everybody. And we need to look at international organizations, the international system, and the way in which it can really help. And for example, the Prime Minister has spoken about the need to look at the WHO and to make sure that it's properly designed, can work to achieve the resilience we need in the international health system. And some familiar alliances as well, like NATO, for example. Are they equipped? They're ready to be able to deal with some of the challenges which are coming our way. Then the national responses, and it's really interesting to hear Elisabeth speak, and she's written eloquently about the whole of society resilience and what that actually means. How do we all, and you on this call, on this webinar, how do we together make the country more resilient? We have some definitions of critical national infrastructure, which I think we'll have to look at, because I think that definition is going to have to broaden. but what is the deal if we designate things critical national infrastructure? What is the offer from government, and what is the requirement on those who are designated as being critical national infrastructure? That's something which I think we're going to have to get into. How do we incentivize the right kinds of behaviour? And Elisabeth, you got into this a bit, and the government traditionally, how does it incentivize behaviour? Well, it spends money sometimes in order to get people to behave in a particular way, and sometimes we may need to do that. But there's never enough money for all the things we want to do. It can legislate. It can put requirements. Elisabeth, you mentioned one in terms of legislative requirements on shareholders or on reporting of companies. So, are the legislative requirements right? Do we need to change them at all? And if we are going to legislate, then what are we? What is again our offer back? Do we do it through education? Again, Elisabeth, you spoke about that, and information. And we have quite a lot of work which we do on countering disinformation in order to help our resilience. Do we need to go further with that? How else can we, educate people beyond just the experience of the events, which we've all experienced, of course, in the last few months, which will have, I think, a very long-term, a very big impact on the way we think. But how can we organise that and structure it in a way which is actually going to help? How do we tackle risk? I mean, in some cases, the markets exist, and insurance market exists partly to deal with risk. Do we diversify? When we think about the supply chains, should we be diversifying into other countries so we're not so dependent on one particular country? And of course, we can plan and prepare and exercise, and those are things which we do. But I think we're going to have to do more, and we're going to have to do it in more areas, so that we can be more thorough about our preparations, particularly where we know there's a risk. But we don't know exactly what its impact is going to be and where, and therefore having a precise plan is quite a hard thing to do. And how do you do both the planning but also the preparation? Do you need to create greater reserves of people? People kicking around the chat the idea of having more of a reserves force that has some cost to it, but is that a way of creating a deeper societal resilience? I suspect that what we will come to, and I don't want to prejudice the outcome of the review, we're just getting into it now, is to look at how do we most effectively spread this burden across our society and our businesses and our economy in a way which is going to work for all of us. We've seen in the national cybersecurity space the greater use of companies and individuals in order to be able to achieve the effect we want to. And it can't just be for the government alone, but the government can lead in this, and it can help to organize things in a way which will work for all. So just to conclude, I think that resilience is going to be a great buzzword, and those of you familiar with government can be sure that every bid which we get in for spend will include something about resilience and how important it is. But I think there's a lot of expertise in this audience and elsewhere, and we need to listen to that. And I'm very interested, obviously, to pick up your views now, and indeed through Resilience First afterwards, about how can we actually create a review which achieves the effect of making this country more resilient, not just through government, but through all of us. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Elisabeth. Really interesting tour of some of the things that will be picked up now as part of the integrated review, and resilience absolutely key. So we have a variety of questions coming in. I will please do add more and bear with me as I try and get to yours on the list. So we have a question from Paul. Can we afford to bring more of the critical supply chain for critical industries, so cyber, electronics, defence, security, etc., back on shore? And will this help national resilience? Alex, would you like to answer that, and then perhaps Elisabeth?
Sure, let me have a go, Paul. It's absolutely a question. It's a question of the moment. So, as I said, the UK is an unusually international country, a global country, I would say, and has benefited from that. And obviously, one of the risks of the pandemic, if I listen to some of the people who have studied previous pandemics, they say pretty much every pandemic in history has been followed by a burst of protectionism. So there is a real risk of that, although I think we're in a rather different world from the one we were in some previous pandemics. we can, so there's a balance to be struck in terms of the increase in our security and the risk to our economy of onshoring and so forth. But essentially, the United Kingdom benefits from being open and benefits from an open world. But we have to be clear-eyed that this isn't the world. This really is not the post-1989 world anymore, and that mainly, it's not, globalization is not kind of unfettered good, which is going to bring benefit to all. It does increase risks in some areas. So I think we have to go through a kind of careful exercise of looking at in which areas do we think that we do need to retain sovereign capability, and that may not be very big, but it may exist. Of course, it exists already in some areas, particularly in the defence side. We do retain a sovereign capability. We then have to think, well, where could we do this with allies? With economically dynamic countries with whom we have a good and close relationship, because where you can, you want to share the load. And the United States is one obvious ally. There are others as well who would want to work with in Europe and also around the world. And I think if you're going to see the increased economic dynamism, particularly in Asia, and that who could we be working with more, and on what kinds of technology, for example, where we want to do that, and where are we kind of happy just to where would we want to diversify risks just by having other sorts of supply chains, and where are we happy for the market to work. And that requires quite sort of intense scrutiny of different areas of possible of products where where there may be a security element tied to it. Not the case with my shirt, I'm guessing, but maybe the case with some bits of the technology which sit inside the laptop I'm speaking to you from. And that is, we're kind of working our way through in quite a lot of detail where that might be the case. And I hope that integrated review will give a sense, particularly of a few of the technologies where we feel we will need to have a kind of sovereign capability or an allied capability. And we'll have to give a sense of countries where we think we can work with most closely on that.
Thank you. Any additional comments from you, Elisabeth?
So the only thing I would add is that this, again, requires the active participation of industry. So it's easy to say we need such and such capabilities in the country. Well, the government in virtually all European countries, the government no longer owns a lot of industry. So it does have to work with individual companies in individual sectors to incentivize them to be part of the solution. And I think actually companies and business leaders do see the big picture if they just given the opportunity to understand national security threats. And by the way, this is something that the US Department of Energy and other departments do really well. They have these regular briefings for business leaders where they are essentially told about national security threats, not for them to do anything in particular about it, just for them to be aware of what's happening. And that's something that I think it could be instrumentalized in other countries as well. I know it goes on an ad hoc basis. And then very quickly about to bring back the reporting and annual reports. I think it might make sense to have either a requirement or, again, peer pressure for companies to put in their annual reports whether they are single source for key components or whether they have alternative supply chains. Obviously, no company will ever know the entirety of its supply chain. It's just too unwieldy. But at least for primary suppliers, for them to have, for companies to have, not just single source for key components, but the alternative suppliers as well.
Thank you. Really interesting. Question from Simon. Given some of the risks are high on the National Risk Register, given those risks can realise more quickly than the responses, should we recreate a response and or recovery volunteer reserve into the integrated mix? I'm going to ask Elisabeth to respond first. I suspect I know what your answer is likely to be. Should we have a volunteer reserve for resilience? Oh, you're on mute, Elisabeth. Elisabeth,
volunteer reserve, is that the question, or is it? Of course, we need a volunteer reserve. We need opportunities for people to do their part in national security in many different kinds of ways. And I think that the tragedy in the UK at the moment is that people's understanding of how they can contribute to national security is really is limited to potentially joining the armed forces or the armed forces reserves. Well, what if we had volunteer components for other critical functions as well? And that's something where obviously it would be a burden on the government to train people, but it would be a phenomenal resource, allowing the government to surge in a crisis. And something that I've proposed, for example, is competitive national service across the government, where the government would get to select the best and the brightest teenagers, small numbers of them, for all government agencies involved in national security, ranging from the armed forces to the NHS, and train them, give them specialist training for a year. And then these people, young, talented people from, by the way, all kinds of backgrounds, because school background wouldn't matter. What would matter would be aptitude as measured in aptitude tests. These people would then form a fantastic reserve that would allow the government to surge in whatever the area is where the crisis happened to occur. And so again, I think it's what we need is a different view or approach to the public, where we need to view the public as a resource rather than as a burden on society that the government needs to look after, with training either at a basic level or to a specialist level. We can turn the public or parts thereof into a fantastic resource for the crisis resource for the government.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just going to add a bit onto that question before handing it to Alex. Something from Hank. Is it time now for a ministry for resilience, or at least a resilience team in each ministry?
Let me try and take the first question and the Simon's question and Hank's question. So, I mean, today you have, particularly in the armed forces, you have the concept of sort of depth and reserves. And I think the really interesting question is the one posed, which is whether you need to expand that out or vary it to other kinds of reserve. What we've seen in the case of the armed forces is we use them a lot for different kinds of function. And they're highly effective, particularly so that in the case of COVID, they're planners. And that's and they're very rapidly available, and they will kind of follow what they're asked to do by the governments. I think that resilience does require kind of more depth of people. I think we're going to have to look at how you organize that. So I wouldn't want to commit on that, but it's certainly something we're looking at. And that, I think, goes much wider than the armed forces into other areas. It's quite interesting to me to see how different organizations get into this. And it's interesting, the NHS, it goes for, recently retired colleagues, quite a lot of whom came back to work in the NHS. So there was a sort of trained depth there, which was useful. I think, well, where might we need those? Even outside the concept of reserves, I think, again, going back to the example of cyber, you have more people who feel that they are kind of part of resilience in cyber, partly for kind of personal interest, but and I think you're all going to have to reach out to different bits of the population and indeed to businesses in order to be able to achieve that effect. Sorry, can you remind me of Hank's question, the second question?
So Hank's question.
Machinery of government, that's right, yeah.
Ministry of Resilience.
I think that part of the integrated review will have to be looking at our systems, whether that means creating a department or not, I'm not so sure, but what is the way in which we can join up the different bits of government to be able to deal with a problem as it occurs or before it occurs, because it's clear, if you look at the case of COVID pandemics, that requires a really whole of government effort, and you've seen the implications of COVID across the different bits of government, really very, including, for example, on supply chains in a way we might not have anticipated. We do a lot of exercising on this sort of stuff, but I think it's really shown just how much you need to join up bits of government. Whether a ministry is the right way to do that, I'm not so sure instinctively, whether you integrate a new ministry or not. But then how do you incentivize the different bits of government to come together? And that may partly be through the work which the Prime Minister is keen that we do in terms of tightening the link between number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and how the Cabinet Office functions as a place which enables the departments to come together. So I suspect it may be more through that, but some kind of change of system, I'm sure we will look at as part of the review.
Great, thank you. There's a theme of questions around, which includes one from Neil. Do you think businesses and other communities are still waiting for central government to tell them what to do rather than seeing it for themselves? And there is an interesting comment from Rick. This is in several layers. You have to be able to look at and create the right incentives for all layers across government, industry, and the public. And then also Elisabeth's question: how do you balance between government, security, and technology organisations to cooperate on threats? So I think bringing that together, is this something that business should be taking the initiative on? Is this something that we feel that business is still waiting for government to set the framework for? Elisabeth, do you want to give some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so those are really good questions. Who should start for this sort of cooperation to work? I think the reality is that businesses have been, in a sense, spoiled. They haven't really been asked to do anything much for society in the past couple of decades. They've only been asked to go out and make money for themselves, and as a result to grow the economy, which is of course a good thing for the country. And so now the person posing the question is, I guess it's fair to say his assumption is right, which is that, or his point is right, which is that businesses are waiting for the government to provide instructions. Well, that is just not going to happen in every crisis. I think we need to get away from this idea that the government will micromanage and instead get into a mindset where the rest of us can be active participants in our own fate. And for companies, that means not just doing the bare minimum in following government guidelines, but actually thinking to how they can be a productive part, because it's in their interest that the country, whether it be the UK or the US or any other Western country, that country recover quickly. And so, for example, I think about, I've thought about in the past few months, companies, for example, coffee chains that decided to close simply because it was inconvenient to stay open, even though they could have stayed open and sort of done their part to at least make our lockdown a bit less bleak. Or Ryanair, where Mike O'Leary said that he's not going to, it doesn't make sense for him to have the middle seat free. It's that sort of fragmentation of society that really worries me, where it's companies do what's good for them, we citizens do what's good for ourselves, or who is going to do what's good for the community and for the country, which is really what's needed in crisis. So I think, again, with regular consultations, the government reaching out to business leaders, not just the risk manager, but the most senior leadership, to treat them as peers in this really vital work that we need to do, which is limiting the effect of the crisis that will come our way. I think that's really the best way. And then it's not a burden on businesses, but actually it's in their interest to be part of that response.
Thank you. Thoughts from you, Alex?
Thanks very much, Cate. So some businesses obviously are heavily involved in trying to find solutions to this crisis. And if you take the example of vaccines, there's clearly an enormous value in vaccine development and production. And that's, because the solution to the health crisis gives you a very big answer to your economic problems which are coming our way. So it's interesting, in some areas I think they're kind of natural partners and government speaks to them a lot, and that feels kind of right and familiar. But I would have thought that this crisis will push us to a closer, a better understanding, a better engagement between business and government about what the real risks are. And I think Elisabeth, you were saying that, in the US they're quite good at explaining their risks and talking to business about them and showing the risks. And I think businesses are very smart and they can see some of the ways in which they can respond to that. There will also be some market pressures too, I suspect, because of, I guess, analysts and so forth will look at the potential resilience of countries and say, of companies, and say, well, how resilient is this company? You obviously had a big example of that after the 2008 financial crisis, where essentially as a result of legislation and events, you have a far more resilient banking sector than you did in 2008, and that was a combination of legislation and action by the banks. So it is possible. It tends to be response to particular incidents. This has been one which is so broad that I would hope we would have a chance to take a kind of different approach in looking at resilience and factoring resilience into business planning. But I would think at the start of that has got to be the kind of engagement between government and business about what the risks are and how we see them developing.
Thank you. A couple of sort of bigger picture policy questions from Nick and Robert. So given the uncertainty we see, are we looking at different futures for the UK? And will the integrated review therefore plot the UK's role in a changing world? Followed up by, are we likely to revise the Civil Contingencies Act? Alex, would you like to take that one? Or those two?
Sure. We'll certainly have to look at the Civil Contingencies Act. Whether we need to change it, we can't say yet, but we'll have to see. At the moment, it's very much focused on local government and whether we need to change its scope or change definitions in any way. So I think we will have to look at it, but I can't yet say what might come out of that. Nick, yes, I think this is just a harder world, basically. I think that's not new. That was happening since 2008, but COVID has really shown it. This is a tougher world in which to operate. In the UK, I just keep repeating it, but I do think it's an unusually international, global country, is going to have to work harder to achieve the effects that it wants. Now, it has the opportunity of having full sovereignty to do so, and now must work out what to do with that. What do we want to do with that? And of course, I'm sure departments will go to the Treasury saying that this is much harder and therefore we need more money. We'll see what happens with that. But it will require more joined upness between the different bits of government in order to achieve, for example, where you think you need technological advantage over the next 10 years, where you think you're really going to have to develop some technology, for example, in quantum computing, take example. That's going to have to be a whole of government effort, and not just divvied up between the different departments who have different interests in this area. Picking up a point which Peter Watkins made, I think you're going to need continue to attract and retain talented people who can adapt into different situations, or indeed in different departments. Because what I think is very hard to do, given the degree of uncertainty which COVID places on futures, is to be very confident about a single future. And therefore, you're going to have your kind of 3 or 4 scenarios. You'll have your more likely and less likely ones. But you'll have to have the ability to be able to adapt to the different scenarios whilst understanding where your interests lie. And that is, COVID has kind of shown us a bit where some of our interests may lie, and who we need to work with in order to achieve that. But you are going to have to create a culture of adaptability with competent people who can move around, who can operate in a pretty uncertain scenario, I'd say. And that gets very hard when you get to some of the big and expensive decisions, for example, which Peter will be very familiar with, about what kinds of military equipment you buy, and how they can be deployed according to the different scenarios which you have.
That's really interesting. And just let's dive a bit deeper into Peter's question, because there are several questions around the training and how we upskill people. So how do we build an adaptive, skilled and diverse national security community? Do we need a national security college? Nick has suggested a national cyber academy. And Jamie has said, well, okay, if we're going to create these resilience reserves and that ethos, we're struggling to recruit into the National Youth Service. the National Youth Scheme, how do we, if we're going to create a greater ability to train people in resilience or resilience reserve, how do we get people into those opportunities in the first place? Elisabeth, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes. How do we train people who are other than teenagers, who are a captive audience, as it were? And well, not captive audience, I shouldn't say, but it's easier to train teenagers than the rest of us. There is a fantastic model that doesn't answer every question, but would be a fantastic way to start in the UK, which is the national defense course that Finland has and has run now for 61 years. And if this were a live audience, I would take a show of hands to see whether anybody has heard of it. So to make sure I'm not repeating something that most people know, but I guess I can't look at the chat and see if anybody knows. Well, you can type in if you feel like you have to tell me that you're familiar with it. But the way it works, and it's a fantastic scheme, really, is that senior managers across government, the armed forces, politics, business, and the third sector, including academia, every year nominate rising middle managers or people in their 30s, essentially 40s, who get to attend this national defense course. It's a almost 1 month long residential course, but all these people, a small group is selected each year, where they learn about Finnish national security based on the Finnish national security strategy. They learn about the threats facing Finland and obviously what the country is doing to defend itself against those threats. And again, it's not just your usual suspects in the armed forces and the government, it's across all of society, which means that when people then rise to the top within their respective fields, they have this basic level of knowledge. And by the way, there are repeat courses every year where the people from the same group get together and get refresher training, obviously see each other again. So that means that you have this critical mass of leaders, including in fields that are not related to national security, who are familiar with national security, and they know one another as well, in a way that in most countries, I mean, what is the likelihood that somebody, a senior military official, would know somebody in the world of music, for example, very well? It just happens if they happen to be social acquaintances. Well, with this sort of scheme, that can be engineered so that you have this combined shield against whatever the threat or form of aggression is. Then what was the rest of the question? How to incentivize? What was the other
how do we get people interested in doing those things?
Yeah,
but actually we're 3 minutes to the end, so, and that's been a fabulous answer. And actually,
all right, I'll leave the 3 minutes, Alex.
so I'm going to draw us to a close there. Thank you ever so much to Alex and to Elisabeth. Thank you to Resilience First for hosting this. It's been a really interesting, actually, tour de force of what are the issues around resilience and what has COVID taught us, ranging from the role of government in setting the framework and the incentives, and actually building the international relationships that will need to change slightly as we go forward as well as looking at what do we need in terms of sovereignty, the CNI, and the role of companies in resilience and what they build internally, just as much as what we see government asking them to build. And then also the role of the individual, either through education, exercising, training, but empowering individuals so that they are helping the nation as we go into and indeed grow out of any of these new threats, building on the technology, the cyber capability, the skill sets that we're going to need in society that we haven't had previously, and all accelerated by the COVID pandemic. So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, Robert, to host this. It's been great fun and really interesting. Would you like to say a few closing words?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Cate. This truly has been a fascinating hour, and we've covered a lot of ground. And on behalf of Resilience First and all the participants, I'd like to thank very much the speakers and the chair for the excellent contributions today. I appreciate you are very busy people, and we do appreciate your time on the call today. We will try and summarise it and prove that with you and circulate it to the people who've attended. And Alex, I really would offer our help in any way we can to try and build this bridge between the government and business, as Elisabeth has truly shown that we are very keen to show what we can do and how we can help. So the offer's there, and delighted to have a further conversation at another time. So I hope you'll all join us again for our next webinar, which is on the 9th of July. The title is Leadership in a Pandemic, and we have the CEO of UK Power Networks, the CEO of a consultancy called The Prepared Mind, and a top academic from Glasgow University. So thank you and take care and goodbye.